Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. We haven't had a class in a while. We've had so many other things going on, so we haven't had one, but we're back now. And today I decided we were going to cover contingent sales because it is still probably the most common questions I get asked, and also the most common issue that I'm helping agents deal with is the process of their contingent sales, helping them write it properly to begin with, and then dealing with the transaction later with the contingencies. So I wanted to revisit this because I felt like it's still something that for a lot of agents is still really confusing. And if it's confusing for you guys, the problem then becomes, how are we explaining it to our potential clients? And one of the conversations I have with agents a lot is that, oh, my client doesn't want to do a contingent sale, or they want to get a house first. And so we're going to talk about the issues with timing, the proper way to handle a contingent sale, both as a seller and a buyer. And we're going to start on the buyer side. But we're going to talk about all of those little issues that pop up, obstacles that happen, really the proper way to address it from the very beginning. Okay. So before I share my screen, does anybody have any questions about anything? No? All right, well, let me get the share going. And right now, what you guys should be looking at, what everybody should see, is a page of the RPA. And I put that up first, not because we're going to talk about the RPA, because we're really not. We've talked about that quite a lot. What I wanted to reference, though, is paragraph 3L9, sale of buyer's property. Sale of buyer's property is not a contingency unless checked here. And if we check that box, it will add in the form called the COP. And that's where we're going to start today, is with the COP. So let's move to the next form. But I just want to show you, when you're writing the offer, you've got to make sure you check this box. If you don't check that box and you include a COP, it still does not make the property contingent unless that box is checked here in the offer. So you got to make sure. And I think overall, one of the biggest things that we miss in our offers is checking off boxes. And the reason those boxes are there is to incorporate whatever that item is into the purchase agreement. Okay. So please make sure you're checking your boxes. That's one of the first things I do when people ask me to review their offers, is I double check to make sure boxes are checked. Okay. All right. So let's look at the COP. And we're going to move to that right now. So this is the contingency for sale of buyer's property. Okay. So this is the document that we're going to incorporate with the RPA in order to make the offer that we're making selling. Sorry, something happened. This is what we're going to use to make the purchase of this property, the contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. So what I like to say, the way I like to refer to it is, the up leg is the property that your buyer is purchasing. The down leg is the property that your buyer is selling and acting as seller. So when I say down leg, it's hopefully your listing, and where your client would work as the seller, and the up leg is you representing them as a buyer on their purchase of replacement property. So we're going to talk about both ways, how this works, how the contingency works of selling the property, how the contingency works of buying a property. So here we go. So this is for your buyer. You've written an offer. It's contingent on a property that they're selling. So this by default is an addendum to the purchase agreement. It could be, if I'm adding it as part of a counter, it could be a counter offer that I might put in here, buyer's counter or seller's counter, right? It's okay that it's not to the purchase agreement. If I'm writing the offer at the very beginning, right, and I'm including this, then it's an addendum to the purchase agreement. It's part of the purchase agreement, okay? And this is the date of the purchase agreement. So if I'm writing the purchase agreement today, that's the date that's going to go in there. Okay. Whatever the document is that I'm attaching this to, it's the date that the document was created, not the date that this document was created. Right. So, for example, the purchase agreement, I wrote it yesterday, then this date would be yesterday's. It's the purchase agreement for yesterday. Okay. This is the property address of the property I'm writing the offer on. Okay. So when I put here for property, it's the seller's property. It's the property that I'm now submitting this offer for. So whatever that may be, 123 Smith Street. Okay. Oops. Went to the wrong section there. That's that one. 123 Smith, and that's in Pico. We'll do it here. I'm not the best typist. So that's our property address here now. Okay. This is between buyer and seller. So whatever the buyer's name is and whatever the seller's name is, right? We want to make sure. Oops, I don't need addresses. Sorry. I'm doing horrible as far as typing goes today. The seller's name goes there, right? And this is the buyer's property. This is the property that the buyer is going to sell. Okay. So let's say theirs is Jones Street. And they're also here in Pico. They're just getting a bigger house. Okay. So you've got two different property addresses here. You've got the seller's property address. This is the one we're writing the offer on. And the buyer's property address. This is the property that we're selling that the contingency exists for. Okay. Now, the default, when we get to paragraph 1, buyer's property contingency, it says this agreement is contingent upon. By default, it is buyer entering into a contract for the sale of and closing escrow on the buyer's property, this property that we just typed in here. So if we don't choose something else, what it's stating is we haven't sold the house yet. So we need this contingency to be based on us selling our property and closing escrow. Now, many of you have been with me on these classes a number of times, and you know my stance on it. The proper way for you to have a contingent buyer, meaning I have a buyer that needs to sell a property in order to purchase a property, you shouldn't. Best practice is to sell their home first, put their down leg in escrow. Then that will give you a little bit more strength as a buyer because you've already sold the house. You've already entered into escrow. And then that way, the only contingency that you have moving forward is to close escrow. Okay. So the default, though, is you got to do both. We got to find a buyer on my down leg property and we have to close escrow. Now, think about it from the perspective of a listing agent and a seller. If I've been on the market for 30 days now, which is what our average days on market is, just about every one of our markets is around that 30-day number. I've already been in escrow for 30 days, basically, and you're my offer that I get, and it says you have to sell your house, which means I have to maybe wait another 30 days for you to sell your house before we even, have a buyer on your side. Not to mention I have to wait for it to close. There is some issues there as far as strength of offer goes, because as a seller now, I have to take my house off the market and wait for you. Okay, we'll talk about the protections for the seller in those conditions later on when we get in the form. The other issue that we have is if I get my offer accepted as a buyer who is also a seller, my contingencies normally start when my offer is accepted, which means that if I get my offer accepted on my up leg prior to selling my down leg, I may have to remove contingencies on my up leg prior to my buyer having to remove their contingencies on my down leg. So not only does it make my offer weaker, it puts my seller buyer into a very difficult position as far as time periods go. Okay. So you have to think about not only strength of offer, but logistics. So not only are we, like we said, we're talking about strength of offer, but it's logistics of how your offer is going, how your two transactions are going to run. You're in a much better position. You're in a much better position if on your down leg, the property that you're selling, your buyer has already started going through the process on down there where they've done their appraisals, done their inspections, they're prepared to remove contingencies at some point very soon. That makes your offer a lot stronger, and it puts you in a position as a buyer where you're less stressed because you have a little bit more certainty of what's happening on that down leg that you're dependent on to be able to purchase the up leg. Okay. So the next choice, which is like A was default, we need both. The first choice is 1B, which would be I only am contingent on getting into escrow. That's it. I don't know who that would apply to, but that is the first option. The next one, which is probably the most common or should be the most common, is if I've already sold my house, right? I've already entered escrow with a buyer on my down leg, would be for me to check off 2C, which is the only contingency I have is in the concern of this transaction is that I'm able to close my down leg transaction, that buyer is that I'm able to close with that buyer. That's the only thing I'm making it contingent on. Now, if I could do that, again, we talked about strength of offer. I have a much stronger offer than somebody who now has to also wait to sell their house. Okay. In this case, when I check this off, I have to put the escrow, right? The escrow company that we're in escrow with. I have to put the escrow number and what the close date is for our escrow. Okay, so let's say right now our close date is December 10th. Okay, put that in. I can then, again, if I want to create strength of offer, the default is I'm sending you proof, a copy of the contract for sale of buyer's property and the contact information and escrow number for that sale collectively, escrow evidence is attached to the COP form. Or if I don't have it, I'm going to send it to you in 2 days. You can check that box. So basically what it's saying is if I check off this contingency, I'm going to give you the escrow number. I'm going to give you a copy of my purchase agreement and the contact information for the escrow so that you can follow up with escrow, see where we're at, see how confident that we can, verify that everything is moving forward. And I show you what my offer looks like, where the contingency periods are, and things like that. Okay, so if we're doing things, the best way on a contingent sale, we've already sold the property, our down leg, we've already entered escrow, our down leg. This is how we would fill out this form. Okay, so let me pause right there for a second. Questions? Anybody have any questions? No? Okay, good. Either I'm explaining this really well or I'm just confusing you guys more, and then I'm going to have more issues in the coming weeks with people writing offers. Okay, so now we get to paragraph 2. This is if you've either left it at the default of paragraph 1 of 1A or you've added 1B, right? You've done 1B, then you have to fill out this section. The default terms of the contract are you have 17 days after you get this offer accepted to get into escrow with a buyer on your down leg. Okay. Then it says by the time earlier by the earlier of the time specified in 2A or within 2 days after buyer entering into the contract for the sale of the buyer's property, buyer shall deliver the evidence to seller of an escrow holder, right? So the stuff that we just talked about right here for 1C, you would do after the 17-day period was up and you've accepted an offer on your down leg. Okay. So you only have to do paragraph 2. You only have to worry about paragraph 2 if 1A or 1B are part of this COP. Okay. Paragraph 3, listing and MLS status of buyer's property if 1A or B applies. So again, this is only for if your contingency is subject to paragraph 1A or 1B. If it's 1C, you don't need to worry about this. I don't have any, I mean, you should probably fill it out anyway. Just give the MLS ID just to show it, but this is only required if you're a 1A, 1B situation on your COP. Buyer has signed a listing agreement for buyer's property or shall within 3 days after acceptance sign a listing with real estate brokerage. Buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS in the geographic area where buyer's property is located, or buyer's property will not be submitted to the MLS in the geographical area where buyer's property is located. Buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and, if applicable, the MLS listing within 1 day after acceptance if buyer's property is already listed with a real estate broker, or if not already listed, within 1 day after listing with real estate brokerage. Okay. 4, close of escrow of buyer's property. If 1A or 1C applies, right? Because now we're just talking about close of escrow as a contingency. Buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. So now it's telling you when you're going to close escrow, when that contingency period is basically up, right? Because escrows can get extended, they can close early, right? So we can look at my down leg and say maybe there's an extension. Well, this contingency is saying here we're telling you that your down leg escrow has to close by this date, or we can ask you to remove the contingency and move forward. So here's what the terms are. The scheduled close of escrow of seller's property is by default. So, for example, I write this offer with the COP, contingent on me selling my down leg. We have a 30-day escrow, and I submit that and get that offer accepted today. That would give us till December 14th, right, to close escrow. I'm supposed to close escrow on December 10th on my down leg. This contingency of closing escrow on the down leg by default will be due on December 14th. So any extensions that I may get on my down leg, I'd have to then also create an extension for those contingencies on the up leg. I'd have to negotiate that. Okay. Now, if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm going to probably leave that alone, right? The default of our contingency period is removed for close is due on the day we're supposed to close escrow. Okay. If I'm a listing agent and I have to put this in because the buyer's agent failed to do it properly when they submitted the offer, then I'm probably going to check this box that says no later than 5 days prior to our scheduled close of escrow. So if the buyer can't use this if we get to that point, right? If you see that prior to the scheduled close of escrow seller's property, once buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel the agreement. So even if the buyer has not removed the contingency of closing escrow in writing, if their property closes escrow and we're still open on the up leg and they attempt to cancel with that contingency doesn't exist for them any longer. Okay. So that's close of escrow on buyer's property. Okay. Questions? Nobody has any questions about anything right now? I'm shocked. All right. Hopefully that's good news. All right. Let's look at the status of sale of buyer's property. I think this is Angel. Did you want to say something? All right. Jesus, go ahead.
Yes, Kyle. So I was a little confused about the last part you say, that being the buyer's agent, we should check it, but it didn't check it. I got a little confused. I paid attention, but I didn't get it. I'm sorry. Can you
No,
repeat
it's
that
okay.
again?
If I'm the buyer, I'm going to leave it at the default that my contingency due date for close of escrow is the close of escrow date on the property I'm purchasing, right? So the due date for the close of escrow contingency on my down leg is the same as the close date on my up leg. I'm going to leave it alone. If I'm a listing agent and I want to put a little pressure on the buyer because the buyer failed to send a COP, it happens all the time. I see transactions all the time where a buyer says, oh, it's contingent on us selling our house, but they never send the COP. If I know that as a listing agent, part of my counter process is going to be including a COP. And if I have to include the COP, I'm going to check this box that they have to remove their contingency of the sale of their down leg 5 days prior to us closing escrow. Does that make sense? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it makes sense.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Moving on. The status of the buyer's property. Buyer agrees to keep seller informed about the status of transaction for the sale of buyer's property, including any changes, modifications, addenda, amendments to the terms of the accepted offer, or delays to or removals of contingencies within 2 days after seller's request, but no earlier than the applicable time to remove contingencies in the contract for sale of buyer's property. Buyer shall deliver seller evidence of the removal of those identified contingencies. So basically what it's saying is you have to be transparent with the listing agent and the seller on your up leg about what's happening in your down leg. So if there's an extension of time done for something, you've got to tell the seller. If a buyer fails to remove a contingency, you got to tell a seller. Right? When the buyer removes the contingencies, you have to tell the seller, hey, they've removed their contingencies. So hold on. First, I got only the person sending the COP can check mark the COPCR. I don't, you know what, Tina, you had your hand up. I know. Let's do this verbally because I'm not sure I understand your written question. I'm sorry if it's me being confused. So here you go. Go ahead and unmute Tina. And
no, it was just that one part where it says that if we check that if the buyer's agent doesn't send back the COP and the listing agent returns that COP and we check mark that they can't use that contingency of closing escrow to back out of the deal, but it's only the person that sends a COP can check mark that, correct?
Right. Yeah. You can't make changes to it. So like if I get a COP and I don't like the terms of it, I still have to counter it and do a new one request for them to sign that one and ignore this one. Right. So yeah, you can't make any changes to anything after the fact.
Okay. That was my question. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Jesus, go ahead. Jesus? Where'd you go? You had your hand up. I thought I asked you to unmute. Did you have another question?
I couldn't talk because I was muted. Okay, yes. Now, this contingency is going to be treated as any other contingency because you mentioned it's not going to be automatically removed, correct, by the listing agent that sends the COP. It needs to be still removed by the buyer. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's like every other contingency. It has to be removed in writing. It has to be removed on a contingency removal form to be removed. Yeah, nothing is automatic. There is no contingency that is automatic. And I had a conversation with an agent yesterday where they said, well, my seller wants to keep the deposit, but they haven't removed all the contingencies, but they're way past their times. It doesn't matter. If you go past your time, that contingency continues to keep rolling along until you have them remove it in writing. So yes, just like any other contingency, the buyer would have to remove this in writing. But like any other contingency, if we get to that date and they don't do it, I send a notice to perform and then they're required to.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Cancellation of buyer's property. If buyer's property is in or enters escrow and either party to that escrow gives the other a notice of cancellation of contract, buyer within 2 days thereafter shall deliver to seller written notice of that cancellation. So again, you have to tell the seller if your down leg cancels. And there's so many times that I've had conversations with agents, or agents have told me, yeah, I'm going to cancel with this buyer, but I have another one right away. And then they don't tell the buyer, the seller, the listing agent until they've accepted their other offer. That doesn't work like that. Once you have cancellation on your down leg, the seller has the right to cancel on you on your up leg. Okay. So you have to keep that in mind. Okay. All right. Questions about cancellation? Anybody? All right. Backup offers and seller's right to require buyer to remove contingencies or cancel. So backup offers, after acceptance, seller shall have the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale. For backup offers, the parties acknowledge that broker shall not violate MLS rules requiring accurate property status reporting. So what that's stating is, yes, you can offer it for backup offers, but you cannot have it as active. You have to follow the MLS rules. So what the MLS rules state are that if you have an accepted offer and you want to get backup offers, your status has to be active under contract. That's the CRMLS rules. I don't know any other MLSs. I don't know if Bakersfield or any of those others have different rules. But as far as the CRMLS goes, if you are offering your property for sale for backup offers in order to attract backup offers, it is active under contract. And that's the only way you can have it. Okay. So I get this offer accepted. Right? I'm the listing agent. I accept your offer on the COP. I am going to continue to leave it on the MLS as active under contract because removal of buyer contingency and proof of funds, unless paragraph 7C3 is checked, and we'll just talk about that in a second. If seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified in paragraph 7C1 or 2, seller shall have the right to give written notice to buyer to, in writing, remove this contingency, remove the loan contingency, if any, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of buyer's property. Seller may use the bottom of page 2 of this form to comply with the written notice requirements of this paragraph. If buyer fails to complete these actions within 2 days after delivery of such notice, seller may then immediately cancel the agreement in writing. Now, here's the time to give the notices. By default, it's immediately. So again, if I am a buyer's agent, I don't like that it's immediately. If I am a listing agent, I love it's immediately. So if I'm a listing agent and I get one of those offers for a contingent sale where they haven't put it in escrow yet, then I'm going to make sure that my COP is living by this term of C1, which is immediate right. As soon as I get a backup offer, I don't have to wait. It means I can accept your offer right now at 11:30, and at 12:30, I get another offer. I can send you the notice. That's what immediate means. Now, if I'm the buyer's agent, I'm going to check off C2, which is the delayed right to notify, which at least buys me 17 days, which matches the rest of the contingencies. So that what that says is, yeah, you can get all the backup offers you want. The thing you can't do is until 17 days, you can't ask me to remove any of my contingencies and show you proof of funds to close. So it buys me some time. Now, the third one, which is probably not good for anybody because we talk about strength of offer, and for a seller, it doesn't work, is there is no right to notify the buyer. So that means it doesn't matter. I cannot do anything until your contingencies that we agreed to earlier in the form are due, right? Till the close of escrow and all that stuff. So if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm checking this. If I'm a listing agent and I get a COP or I don't receive a COP, I'm going to counter back and make sure it's the default of C1, my immediate right to notify. Questions? I know now there's questions. Yes, go ahead, Jesus. You're up.
Just to make sure the C1 is default.
The what? I'm sorry?
Correct. The C1 choice, it is, and that is default choice, the default.
That's a default choice. Yes,
I thought
C1
it's
is default.
automatic.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
thank you.
automatic. You don't have to do anything. Automatically, that form is that way. And that's the thing, is sometimes I get questions from agents where like, I did a COP like without having a look at the COP, right? I don't get to see it. They just call me or they walk up to my desk and they'll say, we sent a COP and now the seller may want to cancel or whatever. Will they have the option to? And I always say, well, it depends on how you filled out the COP. And they go, what do you mean? So again, this is what I'm talking about. There are things change, terms change, when a buyer can cancel, when a seller can cancel, how a seller can cancel, dependent on how we fill this out. Okay. So again, like I said, if I'm a buyer's agent and I'm writing my offer, then I want to check off C2. If I'm a listing agent, I prefer C1. That's it. End of story. Easy. Okay, Lulu. Yes, go ahead.
So Kyle, just to clarify what you just said. So C1, you recommend as a listing agent to have at our disposal if the buyer doesn't have their property in escrow and we get a backup offer that we want to accept, right?
If you're going to accept an offer where a buyer does not have their property in escrow yet, right, then it is imperative that your COP states that you as seller listing agent have the immediate right to notify them. It has to be that way. That's the only, I mean, if you're a listing agent and you're even contemplating taking an offer from a buyer where their house isn't in escrow yet, the only way you should do it is if it's the immediate right to notify for you guys so you can continue to market it, find another offer that's better. Absolutely.
Okay. Got it.
All right. Removal of contingencies. This contingency can only be removed in writing, even if buyer removes this contingency, unless buyer also performs all action to pursuant to 7B, seller retains the right to cancel the agreement. So what they're saying is in 7B, it says when I remove the contingency, I have to show them the proof of funds. In this context, in the backup offer context, I have to show them the proof of funds, not just remove the contingency. If I can't show them the proof of funds, the seller still has the right to cancel. So it's not just removing the contingency, it's showing that I have money to close escrow without selling my house. And if I can't do that, the seller can still cancel. All right, so here's the seller's right to cancel. Here's all of them, right? We just talked about what, but here it is. Seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. After first giving buyer a written notice to perform, to remove buyer contingencies, to provide proof of funds below if buyer fails to take all actions specified in 7B. After first giving buyer an NBP if buyer fails to enter into a contract for the sale of buyer's property within the time specified in 2A, right? That's the 17 days for them to get in the contract. After first giving buyer an NBP if buyer fails to close escrow for the sale of buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. We talked about that. That's either the seller's, right, the close of escrow on the property that I'm the buyer and I'm buying, or the 5 days prior to that we just talked about. D, after first giving buyer NBP if buyer fails to deliver escrow evidence within the time specified in 1C or 2B. After first giving an NBP to buyer fails to deliver evidence of the listing of buyer's property as applicable submission of buyer's property listing to the MLS within the time specified in 3C. If buyer fails to deliver evidence of removal of contingencies in the sale of buyer's property and specified in paragraph 5B, if buyer gives notice to seller of either party's cancellation of contract or buyer's party. So if you look at F and G, those two do not require a notice to perform. Okay. So if I don't show evidence to the seller, because it says I have to, within 2 days of the buyer removing their contingencies on my down leg, I have to tell the seller. If I don't do that, the seller doesn't have to send me a notice to perform. Seller can cancel. If one of the other, if I cancel on the buyer or the buyer sends me cancellation instructions, even if we're trying to work it out, I have to tell the seller I received the cancellation instructions. And if I tell the seller that, the seller has the right to cancel. So for those of you that I talked about earlier that I've had these conversations with, that you don't tell the seller that your first escrow canceled until you've accepted an escrow right? You've accepted an offer from another buyer. Even when you tell them after you've accepted another offer, they can still cancel on you. So it's so much better to be transparent, be above board, don't hide things from them, just have conversations with them, right? If you're open and you communicate with the listing agent from the beginning, some of this stuff they may not exercise the cancellations because you're clear with them and you're letting them know what's happening. But if you try to hide from them about a cancellation specifically, they can cancel without giving you any notices. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, here's the buyer's right to cancel. Buyer may cancel the agreement in writing if prior to buyer's removal, the buyer's property contingency specified in paragraph 1A, B, or C is applicable. If 1A or B applies, buyer is unable to enter into a contract on buyer's property within the time specified in 2A, or if 1A or 1C applies, either party for buyer's property gives notice to the other to cancel the contract for purchase of buyer's property. Or if 1A or 1C applies, buyer is unable to close escrow on buyer's property within the time specified in paragraph 4. There you go. Very straightforward. That's how the buyer can cancel. Now, let's look at the time for the performance of contractual obligations and delivery of the deposit. Okay. Contract obligations other than deposit. Time periods in this agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations, excluding those in this addendum, shall begin as specified in the agreement, which means all your time periods, your inspections, your investigation period, your appraisal contingency, your loan contingency, all start with the purchase agreement, just like if there was no contingency of sale. The only ones that are different are what are in this addendum, period. If I check the box, then all my time periods start after I remove my contingency, which also goes for the seller, which means it's not just my contingencies, but now the seller doesn't have to give me disclosures. The seller doesn't have to give me any reports. The seller doesn't have to do anything until after I remove my contingencies. So, or I've removed this contingency. So for both parties, seller and buyer, I am advising you to not check this box. But that's also why if I'm a buyer at selling a property, I don't want to start this purchase process until I've already gotten my down leg home in escrow because of that specifically. Because I don't know of a listing agent that actually reads these documents that's going to allow you to not have your contingency start until after you've removed your contingency of sale. So you're going to put yourself in a really weird position or a difficult position because the contingencies on yours are going to start before you even have a buyer on your down leg. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on you. Buyer's deposit, again, by default is the same as the time periods. It's defaulted to the time that's in the purchase agreement, which is 3 business days. Or if you check the box, it would be 3 business days after buyer delivers to seller the escrow evidence and the contingency of selling the buyer's property. I don't think that anybody's going to go for that. Again, we're talking about strength of offer, so don't try to slip it by. There's been many times where even if a seller has accepted that, they don't want to abide by it. So they give people a hard time. They try to cancel. It just turns into a very difficult transaction because everybody's already button heads from the beginning. So leave these as the default. Now the SPRP may be different is going to be different when we get there, and I'll talk about that. But this is the default. This is the way you want to leave it. So that's it. Everybody needs to sign. This is where the seller can use this as a notice to perform. The seller can sign this and send it back to the buyer as a notice to perform instead of actually using an NBP. So that is the COP. Any questions about the COP before I move on? Anybody? Okay. All right. Oh, Tina. Sorry, 1 second. I decided to take a drink of water at an inopportune moment here. Let's go ahead. Go ahead, Tina.
So the default on those, I've clicked those and nobody's ever caught them, me representing the buyer's side.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you you just counter that out, right? Basically, if you catch it, you counter that out before you even open escrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Well, you're going to counter it and you're going to send them a new COP. It's just, it's easier to just say, it's easier in your counter instead of writing all the terms of time periods to remain as
yes,
specified in the agreement. You're just going to say, buyer agrees to sign and return updated COP with this counter offer. And then you're going to do a new COP with the terms you want and send it with your counter.
got it. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Let's go. Next up on the forms is going to be the seller's purchase of replacement property. So we went from what we do as a buyer, where we need to sell a house, sell our property and it's contingent, to what we need to do if our sale of our property is contingent of us finding a replacement property. So now we're moving everything down to the down leg. So everything we talked about before was mostly up leg stuff. Now it's down leg, right? So remember, the property I'm purchasing as a contingent buyer is my up leg. The property I'm selling as a contingent seller is my down leg. Okay. So here we go. Seller's purchase a replacement property. This is, chances are, it's not going to be an addendum to the purchase agreement. It's going to be addendum to the counter offer, because most buyers don't write the offer and include an SPRP, right? Even if I were to tell a buyer's agent that I'm contingent on finding a replacement property prior to them submitting an offer, they're not going to send an SPRP because they don't know the terms. They don't know what we need. And even if they did, it's just going to lead to another counter anyway. So you, as listing agent, when you fill this out, it is going to be an addendum to the counter offer because you're including it in your counter offer. Okay. What's the date of your counter offer? If I'm writing that counter offer today, it's today. Okay. So buyer's name, seller's property, the whole thing is there. It's filled in from previously, but we'll leave it alone. But as you can see, here's the address for the property that the buyer's writing the offer on. Here's the buyer's name. Here's the seller's name. So buyer and seller are referred to as parties. Seller's purchase of replacement property. The first contingency, 1A, finding replacement property. The agreement is contingent on seller entering into a contract to acquire replacement property or identifying a suitable property to move to. That doesn't mean they have to purchase something. Just find a suitable. That means they could lease something, but you could still put the contingency in. And it's a lot better than these rent backs. I know everybody prefers the rent backs, but they are so trouble laden, these rent backs. I don't know how many times we've had issues where buyers agree to one amount of time for a seller to remain, and it turns into another, and it becomes a nightmare. And these contingent sales are better, even if the seller finding a replacement property isn't purchasing something, it's renting. If that was what their intent was, make it contingent on them finding the replacement property. Don't close escrow till they have a place to go. Right now with the inventory, and I just went through stats, and inventory is down again in most of our market areas. Buyers are going to have less of an issue agreeing to longer escrows in order for your seller to find a place, because there is not a lot of options. So seller shall have by default 17 days after acceptance to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement. Now, it's all negotiable. I could change it from 17 to 21 to 30 to 45. You could change it to whatever you want, whatever you feel comfortable with. Even if you leave it at 17 days as the listing agent, you can get an extension. You can negotiate an extension. If you can't negotiate an extension, then the transaction cancels and you move on and find another buyer if that's what your seller still wants to do. So it's not like, I get so many times from agents like, I don't know what to do. 70 days isn't enough. Should I do 30? Should I do 45? Whatever you and your client feels is the best for you and your comfort level and what you believe is going to be the ability of you to find a replacement property, do that. But know that even if you start with day 17, you can get an extension. Extensions can be negotiated. And yeah, is there a chance that a buyer's not going to want to agree to hang around for another 17 days? Maybe. But again, going back to lack of inventory right now, when buyers find a house that they like, they don't want to take a chance of losing it. So they're probably going to give you the time you need. But if you feel more confident with saying, I want 30 days to find a replacement property, then change it to 30. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. Seller shall deliver to buyer at time of removal of the finding replacement property contingency proof of replacement property, either a copy of the contract for purchase of the replacement property and the contact information and escrow number for that purchase, or a signed lease or rental agreement for replacement property, or other written evidence of replacement property. I've had arguments in the past with listing agents where buyer's agents are requesting a copy of the purchase agreement and the escrow information on your upleg, and they're refusing to give it to them. You cannot refuse that. It says right here that you have to give them that. Okay? You have to give them a copy of everything. If it's a purchase, you have to give them a copy of the purchase agreement and the escrow information. If it's a lease, you have to give them a copy of the lease or rental agreement to show proof that they found a place. You have to do that with your contingency removal. Okay. If seller does not remove the finding replacement property contingency in writing within that time, buyer, after first giving notice to seller to perform, may cancel the agreement in writing. Just like the contingencies from the seller to the buyer now has the right to say, hey, I'm giving you notice to perform to remove this within those time periods. And if you don't, then they can cancel, right? So if I get to day 17, you haven't removed it, I can send you a notice to perform. If we give you an extension or you have 30 at day 30, if you ever remove the contingency, I can send you a notice to perform and I can walk. See, the benefit of these purchase or replacement property work both ways for the buyer and seller, because in the past, and I still see it occasionally, somebody just puts this sale is contingent on seller finding replacement property in their counteroffer, but they don't include the SPRP. Well, the problem for that is that I now can't use notices to perform to cancel. So if I'm a buyer, I'm kind of stuck because there is no time period for me to force the seller to remove the contingency and get me out. And if I'm a seller, I'm kind of stuck because there is no time period of that contingency. So the buyer could just say, well, you have all the time you need, keep looking. You know what I mean? It's not that those are just philosophical issues that you could still probably cancel because it's contingent, but it's going to still, it opens up an argument that doesn't need to exist. That's why it's important that when we're contingent, we're including this form. Okay. Now, 1E is the default, or if the seller has already sold their house or found a house, right? They're that reverse. They've already found a house. Seller has entered into a contract to acquire replacement property and find a replacement property contingency is removed. Here is the escrow information. Okay. Now I don't have that. But if I don't have that, if I've already entered, then I've got to make sure I check this box, which is close of replacement property. And you should be doing it anyway. Even if you have 1A, you should be checking 1C, which is close of replacement property. The agreement is contingent on seller's ability to close escrow on the replacement property according to that contract. This is a contingency in favor of seller. Seller, by the scheduled close of escrow date for the replacement property, shall either close escrow or remove this contingency in writing. So it says your ability to close, right? So if we have that box checked off and on our upleg, right, because I've given a copy of the contract to the buyer, it says my close of escrow date on my upleg is December 20th. If by December 20th, I haven't been able to close, which we know we're not going to because we haven't closed the downleg yet. But if by that date we get there, the buyer could technically send me a contingency removal for close of escrow because your close of escrow was supposed to be 12/20. Don't worry about that. Most buyers aren't going to do that, but we can always negotiate extensions on any of that stuff. But you still want to have this close of replacement property in there. Now, the reverse of the COP is the time periods. Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations that commence from date of acceptance shall begin the day after seller delivers to buyer a written notice to removing the finding replacement property contingency specified in 1A, or if we check the box, remain as specified in the agreement. For both of us, we want them to remain as specified. So you got to make sure you check the box. And the same thing for the buyer's deposit. You want to make sure you check the box because you want it to be 3 business days from acceptance, not 3 business days after the seller removes their contingencies. Okay. Close of escrows. This is the close of escrow. This is one that you have to make sure you fill out properly. Parties agree that seller may extend the close of escrow date for the sale of seller's property by a maximum of, I would say at a minimum, you're going to put 30 days in here. And you have to send the written notice. You have to send the extension at the same time that you give written notice of removing the seller's finding replacement property contingency. Then the escrow extension automatically kicks in. The buyer can't deny it. Okay. So please make sure you have something in here, 30, 45 days, whatever. You can always close earlier than what that extension is. But if you feel more confident that you need more time, then 45 days is there. Okay. Any applicable terms that you may not have been in here that you want to address, I don't know what those could be. Cancellation of replacement property. If seller's replacement property is in or enters escrow, or there is another agreement and either party to that escrow agreement gives the other a notice of cancellation, seller within 2 days thereafter shall deliver to buyer written notice of that cancellation. Again, just like the opposite. When the buyer's down leg is canceling, you have to tell the seller. When the seller's up leg is canceling, you got to tell the buyer. Even after the expiration of the time for finding replacement property contingency specified in paragraph 1A, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels pursuant to 1A. Once buyer receives seller's written removal of finding replacement property contingency, buyer may not cancel pursuant to 1A. So once the seller removes their contingency of finding replacement property, the buyer can't use that as a reason for themselves to cancel. Buyer's right to cancel. Buyer may cancel his agreement as follows. After first giving seller an NSP, if seller fails to remove the finding replacement property contingency. After first giving seller an NSP, if seller fails to give proof of replacement property as specified in 1A. 5C, if paragraph 1C is checked after first giving seller NSP, if seller fails to remove the closing of replacement property contingency. D, if seller gives notice to buyer of either party cancellation of the agreement of her replacement property. Note, if seller is unable to meet the obligations for other timeframes in the agreement, such as close of escrow, buyer may cancel as permitted in the agreement, even if this contingency is not removed. All right. Seller's right to cancel. Seller may cancel the agreement in writing as follows. If prior to seller's removal of the finding replacement property contingency, seller is unable to enter into a contract to acquire replacement property. If paragraph 1C is checked, if seller is unable to close escrow on replacement property according to that contract. Buyer costs. If seller cancels pursuant to 6A or B, seller shall return any deposit, and if checked, after delivering receipts to escrow holder, buyer shall be entitled to buyer's reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees under this agreement, which total amount shall be no more than. So if you check this box, if this box is checked on the SPRP, then the seller has to pay for the buyer's costs that were out of their pocket. Or if you check this box and this box, the seller can state, I'm only going to pay you back X amount of money. Now, if I'm the listing agent, neither of these boxes are going to be checked. If I'm a buyer's agent, I'm going to check this box. That doesn't mean you won't get countered. But again, we know, and just like Tina Louise had mentioned earlier, is that agents don't pay attention and sometimes those things get through. So for you guys now as listing agents, please pay attention and read these things. But if I'm the listing agent, this is not going to fly. So I'm going to counter and take that out. But if I'm a buyer's agent, I'm going to put it in when I write my offer. Okay. Here's where we sign. Everybody agrees. So that is it for the seller's contingency and for the buyer's contingency. I did want to talk about how we handle the occupancy stuff after the fact. And maybe what I'll do is we'll just talk about those forms next week. Instead, we'll talk about the seller license to remain in possession and the residential lease after sale. We'll just discuss those in general, but not, and we'll reference back to these contingent sales. Before I let you guys go, does anybody have any questions? No? All right, good. Hopefully that was clear. I'm glad that you guys were all here. Thank you. We had 55 people at one point, so I'm really happy for you guys that you showed up. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for spending an hour with me. If you need anything, you know where to find me. This video will be on YouTube later if you missed any part of it or want a review, just like all my other videos are. So if you know anybody that's not watching those, please share with them. And I'll talk to you guys again soon. Take care and be productive.